Now we go to more meat in this important conference. We had hoped to give you a break, but we know you're strong, and we will continue with our first panel. This morning's panels have been designed to give us a sense of where Quebec is at this moment, where it is going, and how English-speaking Quebec fits into a political climate dominated by, dare I say, a nationalistic identity. Our first panel is being led by my longtime friend and colleague, Richard Bouhris, Emeritus Professor, Department of Psychology at UQAM. Richard's work has been a backbone of evidence-informed public policy at the QCGN. He continues to research and publish on matters of immense importance to English-speaking Quebec, most recently on the consequences of Bill 101 for the French-speaking majority and the English-speaking communities of Quebec, our institutional vitality, and the healthcare system. Richard is joined today by Dr. Jack Jedwab, President of the Association of Canadian Studies, Emilie Nicolas, a Vanier Scholar and PhD in Linguistic Anthropology at the University of Toronto, who co-founded Québec Inclusif. I think that was an unfortunate mistake. But in Québec Inclusif, a movement that actively unites citizens against racism and social exclusion, and QCGN counsel and constitutional lawyer Marion Sandilands. What a panel. It's a terrific panel. I know some of you, Madame Nicolas, I look forward to meeting you in person in the near future. Take it away, Richard.
Hello, bonjour, merci beaucoup. J'aimerais remercier le Québec Community Group Network pour m'avoir invité à ce panel. Et aussi, j'aimerais dire quand même que j'ai beaucoup aimé la prestation de Raymond Théberge concernant le dernier sondage en faveur du bilinguisme sur tous les résultats obtenus au Québec. So there's the image. So the talk is about 9 minutes, and I've used the PowerPoint so that I can be efficient in what I say. So it's entitled Language Laws and 5 Ideological Clarifications for the English-Speaking Communities of Quebec. So I'll go to the first slide. Don't worry about the slide. Don't try to read the slides. I'm gonna read it. So we start with laws contributing to the decline of the English-speaking communities of Quebec. So we know that French language policies in Quebec and now in Canada have the effect of undermining the vitality of the Anglophone and Allophone communities. In the case of education, that occurs in health, judiciary, and possibly even Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom. Here are 3 examples of the decline of the English language education. So I'm focusing on institutional vitality in education. So just a very short historical overview. So Bill 101 restrictions on access to English primary and secondary schools in 1977 succeeded in reducing the English school system to 37% of its original size by 2018. The CAQ government adopted Bill 40 in 2019 to abolish French and English school boards, but English school boards contested Bill 40 and are spared abolition pending court hearings. The third element, the CAQ government adopted Bill 96 this year using the numerous clauses formula. It froze the size of the 5 English CEGEPs at 30,000 by 2029, almost 10 years from now. And the 43 French CEGEPs are grown to 174,000 places also by 2029. The premier logo said, Bill 96 is clear. Anglophones represent 8% of Quebec, and they will get 8% of new spots in the future. These restrictions on education vitality require Anglophone and Allophones to reconsider their prospects as linguistic cultural minorities in Quebec. So here are 5 ideological clarification themes that are worth debating today and also in the weeks to come. The first one is the sociolinguistic situation of French and English communities in Quebec. So, Anglophones and Allophone minorities who stayed in Quebec have proven that they accept the imperative of maintaining the status and use of French. The majority of Anglophones and Allophones became bilingual over the last 20 years. The other point is that the English-speaking communities of Quebec are not responsible for the substantial status and spread of the English language in the world, including within Canada and in Quebec. French in Quebec will always be a minority language relative to English and Spanish in North America. So eroding the status and institutional vitality of English-speaking minorities will never be sufficient to neutralize the international drawing power of the English language for Francophones and Allophones in Quebec. Now, our point number 2, Québécois Francophone rhetorical strategies, and you're well familiar with these. Québécois Francophone national discourse invokes the threat to the French language and cultural identity from the presence of the English language and immigrants of different linguistic, ethnic, and religious backgrounds in Quebec. Witness Bill 21. Québécois Francophone discourse invokes this threat to the French language as justification to erode the institutional vitality of the English-speaking communities of Quebec. Quebec government laws reducing access to English schools and CEGEPs illustrate how the Francophone majority can use its minority status at the Canadian and USA level to justify eroding the institutional vitality of Anglophone and Allophone minorities at the provincial level. Our point number 3, a debating point. Of course, you don't need to agree with all of these. Québécois Francophones needed a paradigm shift from fragile majority to dominant majority. Quebec laws restricting access to minority English schools and CEGEPs are legitimized rhetorically by invoking that Québécois Francophones are a fragile majority in the province when considered in its North American context. Can a formerly subordinated majority, such as Québécois Francophones, accept that it has gained linguistic, institutional, political, and economic dominance within its own territory of Quebec? Can Québécois Francophones accept a paradigm shift by reframing their status position from a fragile majority to that of a dominant majority? Québécois Francophones are a dominant majority imbued with the psychology of a besieged minority, but it is armed with all the tools of the Quebec state. This puts Anglophone and Allophone minorities in a precarious situation under Québécois Francophone rule. Point number 4, Francophones can reframe Anglophone and Allophone minorities as assets rather than threats. Can the Québécois Francophone dominant majority develop the cultural security to view its own linguistic minorities as a responsibility rather than as threatening liabilities? Can Québécois Francophones reframe Anglophone and Allophone minorities as assets contributing to the economic and cultural development of Quebec? Such reframing will make Anglophone and Allophone minorities feel more accepted in Québécois majority society. Quebecois francophones acting as a secure dominant majority could view investment in the institutional vitality of its linguistic minorities as building social capital and social cohesion while enhancing the adaptability of Quebecois society within North American economy. Point number 5, the last one. Rights of Anglophones and Allophone minorities to also own Quebec as their homeland. This is a reset for things that we all understood and we've understood for a very long time. Anglophone, Allophone minorities have the right to consider Quebec as their homeland as much as do the Francophone dominant majority. All pay taxes and have citizenship rights. Quebec Anglophone and Allophone communities built many of their own institutions in Quebec over the centuries, as we all know. They have the collective right to protect and develop their languages, cultures, and institutions. This without being stigmatized as traitors to the dominant French majority. Leaders of the Anglophone, Allophone communities have the right to develop the organizations they need to promote the defense and development of their institutional vitality in language of education, healthcare and social services, judiciary, municipalities, politics, the economy, and within the public administration. We continue with our 5th points. Quebec Anglophone and Allophone communities have the right to have their own mother tongue and culture as pillars of their socio-affective identity, and this as unique and universal as the French language and culture is for the Quebecois francophones. Quebec Anglophone and Allophone minorities are as much part of la nation québécoise as are the Francophone dominant majority. All have equal rights and duties as citizens of Quebec and Canada. Finally, Quebec Anglophones and Allophone minorities, along with Francophone majority, have the right to endorse multiple national, cultural, linguistic, and religious identities, including to Quebec, to Canada, and other nations without stigma or exclusion. And this is the 5th and last talking point that I'm putting on the table today. And this allows us to pursue our first panel. So thank you very much. So now I take this opportunity. I think that the framework is we're going right to the next speaker, which is my friend and colleague, Jack Jedwab. And Jack, say a few words about some of the key points that the audience needs to know about you right now, other than being a great singer.
Well, thanks for complimenting my singing ability, Richard. It's certainly not a career I intend to pursue, despite what some of you heard last night. I'm going to stick with what I'm doing. So, I hope it continues to work for me. Well, basically, for those of you who don't know me, I guess most of you do, because, we've all sort of been one big family for the most part, in these ongoing debates and discussions for some time now. I run the Association for Canadian Studies and Metropolis Canada, which is very focused on immigration integration. Let me get right to, with that said, some of the points that Richard raised, because time's limited, and I have a reputation of talking beyond the amount of time that's allotted to me, so that and there's a lot to digest here, to be fair, in terms of what Richard presented. I do want to go back to something that the commissioner presented, which I thought was really sort of helpful in some ways, but I've had the opportunity to discuss some of those poll results, and I would say that it would be very difficult to imagine that people would be opposed to bilingualism, right? So I don't know that we are sort of moving the needle forward substantially when we're polling in the areas of support for bilingualism, because at the same time that Quebecers, Francophones, Anglophones, and other Canadians will, in any poll I've conducted, not express opposition to learning a second language, you'll see figures in Quebec showing, depending on how the question's put, a significant degree of concern about the position of the French language. And in fact, in the more recent polling that we did last year with the QCGN, about 45% of Francophone Quebecers said that French was more threatened than ever, right? So that really a lot of what we see in debates in Quebec on language issues and around other identity-based issues are rooted very much in the perceptions and the way in which those perceptions are being managed by politicians, largely for electoral purposes. It's very funny, actually, because for many years you'd see sort of barbs thrown back and forth about people practicing identity politics and how unsavory identity politics can be. And you'd have Francophone intellectuals in Quebec accusing non-Francophones of practicing identity politics, or for that matter, other Francophones of doing so. It was a pejorative thing, identity politics. But here in Quebec, actually, these days, with the current government, identity politics seems to be something that's really done positively, right? The government talks about the nationalisme identitaire, and so do commentators, and not as much in a pejorative way. So framing things in identity terms isn't necessarily, nor should it, I suspect, always be characterized as a negative. You know, we are working towards identity formation and multiple identities, but here it's framed through a particular prism, and it's done in zero-sum terms, so that the more your identity is reinforced, the less someone else's identity gets strengthened, right? So very often, let me say that more simply, in Quebec debates as constructed by sort of some politicians, some intellectuals, and some journalists, it's zero-sum in terms of a gain for Anglophones, presumably, or a gain for allophones is decline for Francophones. And the way that dialectic works can be very profitable for some politicians, notably come election time, as we're heading towards an election, but it can have serious repercussions in terms of the political climate and the social climate for language communities, or at least communities identifying on the basis of language. Now, let me get to what Richard said about the various types of majorities, and you talked about fragile majorities and dominant majorities. On that particular point, my sense is politically, and this comes both from observation and some involvement over a few decades with the decision makers or strategists. You get this sort of interplay between what I would say is describing oneself as a minority, in this case I'm thinking the Francophone population, when that's relevant, and describing oneself as a majority when that's relevant. So that language legislation, and for that matter, Bill 21, for example, which is on the secularism issue, its rationale or justification has elements of both, is offered to people through the prism of both. We're a fragile minority, so we need to reinforce language legislation. And you have to accept what we're reinforcing because we're the majority. And it's perfectly legitimate for the majority in a democracy to sort of legislate according to its desire or its will, right? So there's that interplay between we need to do this to protect ourselves because we're a fragile minority that's insecure and threatened, but we're a majority that also needs to impose a series of rules for the purposes of cohesion, right? And similarly, I would argue that you see some of that with Bill 21, right? This sort of fragile majority, which is threatened presumably by a handful of hijab-wearing Muslims, but at the same time is a majority that needs to impose a series of rules around which we all must abide, because presumably that's what democracy is about, right? Even though democracy is also about the protection of minorities, which is the bedrock of democracy, but we don't hear as much about that, right? Because the instrument of government is designed to serve the majority population principally, and operates with the dialectic of the minority-majority framed identities in terms of the way in which policy gets constructed, particularly as we approach election time. So, so I've actually been going through a bit of a sort of existential sort of reflection on some of these issues in the past year. I haven't been as present on language issues. I mean, I've gotten very sort of sidetracked by that pandemic thing, to be fair, and spent quite a bit of time sort of looking and researching what the effects of the pandemic were. But on the language issue, to be fair, for a certain period of time, I actually tried, and I apologize to all my friends and colleagues who are very immersed in this field, to tune out. Right? I tried for a few months to tune out, and didn't get to speak as much to my friend Sylvia as I usually do in the sort of daily, weekly basis. I blame her in part for that too. But but I did tune out a bit. And interesting enough, in doing some polling for QCGN last year in May, 57% of Anglophones don't follow political debates, right, in Quebec. They're not sort of political junkies like I usually am, except for that sort of 3-month hiatus I took. And in taking that hiatus and operating in that sort of bubble, that I noticed that 57% of Anglophones and a significant percentage of Francophones also operate the bubble, so to speak. Like we're not, bubble meaning not paying attention to what's going on here on a day-to-day basis, right? Just tuning out and in doing that, I actually noticed that relations on the ground, right? The situation on the ground, right? You're downtown in Montreal, in terms of the back and forth of French and English, is quite good, actually. The social climate on the ground is quite good, right? And there's a big gap between the climate on the ground and the political discourse, massive gap and a growing gap. And and you see it with some of the chroniqueurs. Par exemple, je parle du Journal de Montréal. Je vois que c'est extrêmement difficile de critiquer les chroniqueurs, right? Ils sont protégés quelque part. On voit un rare critique de, par exemple, Mathieu Bock-Côté. Mais quand je lis Mathieu Bock-Côté, et j'essaie, j'ai pris les 3 mois pour ne plus le lire non plus. Hein. Dans les 3 mois, je dis, je ne veux pas lire ça parce que ça me fait whatever. Mais quand je lis ces chroniques, j'ai comme l'impression que la bataille qui est en train de poursuivre est une bataille perdue. Parce que ce qui se passe à Montréal, où les gens s'entendent bien, right, relativement parlant, c'est beaucoup plus saine que le discours qu'il entreprend ou entretient dans ses chroniques. So I guess what I'm saying there is that there that whole discourse about Montreal versus the rest of Quebec, where you hear Montreal is too bilingual, dangerously bilingual. Immigrants are fueling this bilingualism, and the premier is going to hammer away at that, I'm sure, quite extensively as we get closer to the election campaign. It's interesting that the language issues are resurfacing with a lot of energy around the election campaign. Of course, that's planned, right? The whole sort of putting the final touches on Bill 96 is sort of timed with the election, obviously, and there's going to be a big census release coming up, right? As we know, in August. We need to watch carefully for that, because you rest assured that policymakers, or not policymakers so much as politicians, are going to try to find ways to construct and unpack those census results to reinforce the language legislation and the statements that accompany the legislation that you're hearing, right? With that majority-minority interplay and the fragility issues. And here's the census only reaffirms why we needed Bill 96. I assure you that is what you're going to hear no matter what the census results say, because you're going to continue to see things unpacked in this majority-minority dialectic, where you have to ask yourself the question, if Francophones are the minority, who's the majority on the island of Montreal, right? Who is that? Are non-Francophones a majority? I suppose in some imagined planet they are the majority, but they're not a group. They are not a group, right? So there's this conflation which serves the purpose of these intellectuals and these journalists, not my friend Emilie Nicolas, of course, and some politicians that want to, in that majority-minority dynamic, describe the others, that is to say the non-Francophones, particularly in Montreal, as constituting some form of loose majority that behaves like a majority. So that means all the people coming here, the Ukrainian, Afghan, and others, since they're not francophones, they're part of that dominant majority. Can you imagine? You've come from these countries and you settle here, and voila, you're part of a dominant majority as constructed by, again, this sort of group of politicians, intellectuals, and journalists, or columnists rather than journalists. I don't know that I should call them journalists necessarily, but it's a big challenge to respond to that. And we need to think very creatively and innovatively about responding to some of it, and being very cautious in our response, not to get drawn into the terminology that is deployed by government, right? And we are getting drawn into that terminology very often, into the symbolism of it in our response to this, right? So that means we'll need to, be very sort of astute when we see those census results, which we should be thinking about reasonably soon. We'll need to think about it a bit over the summer, while at the same time understanding that underlying the demographic and demolinguistic facts, so to speak, are perceptions. Changing those perceptions is not something that we're going to be able to do easily, right? And we'll need to think very carefully about how we can get our message across. I'm seeing a lot of messaging. Let me finish on this, actually. A lot of messaging coming from organizations that the government is funding. I don't know if you've noticed, the FTQ, has a message and billboards about the right to speak French at work. It's a right? The workplace in Montreal, whether one likes it or doesn't, as is Montreal, is a very bilingual place in many areas. It's also the fact that the Island of Montreal is a very bilingual place. Whether those columnists like it or not. And that said, there's nothing contradictory about the bilingualism of Montreal, which is a function of increasing percentages of Anglophones and allophones able to speak French more than ever in the history of Quebec. Are people able to speak French? 94% of Quebecers are able to speak French. 94%. I heard the commissioner talked about 99%. You can't get much higher than that. Well, 94%, you can't get a lot higher than that either, right? 94, and yet 45% of Francophone Quebecers think that French is more threatened than ever. So you have to ask yourself why, when 94% of Quebecers are able to speak French, that 45% of Francophones say it's more threatened than ever. Right? And in large part, that's because the bar keeps getting shifted. It just keeps getting shifted. And one of the things that we get drawn into is the idea that French must be the common language of public life. I think I've even seen the QCGN say, we agree that French must be the common language of public life, right? And that's been one of these ongoing, it's part of our language legislation DNA, if you like. French, that sort of catchphrase. What does that mean? I put the question to everybody. What does it mean for French to be the common language of public life? Does that mean everywhere you go on the street, right, people must be speaking French? Because that's a bit the idea that gets instilled when you use these catchphrases. It's the common language. So that enables certain columnists, for example, and others to say the bar should be at 100%. But I was at McDonald's near Place des Arts last week, and the people behind the counter were speaking English. They were speaking English to each other. At least these anecdotes are, I was at Simon's and lots of people were speaking English. Yeah, that's probably because they're Anglophones or they're tourists from the States, or some, or they're going back and forth because their partners, like in my case, are Francophones, right? That's the reality of Montreal. But because we've set this bar and allowed this bar to be set that way, we are increasingly going to be challenged by never reaching the target that is being set by this group of people that are controlling to a significant degree significant parts of the media, the academy, and the government, setting a bar that's not a bar that can ever be met. And let me say in closing, the argument you're going to hear a lot after the census comes out, which we constantly hear about Francophones becoming the minority on the island of Montreal, right? Well, you're going to hear more and more of that, but the reality is, and the government knows this full well, right, that when 80% of your immigration is allophone, right, and 40 and 55% of your population on the island is Francophone, independent of what category you use, yes, you're going to see a diminishing of people whose first language in percentage terms and or language spoken at home primarily is French. That's going to diminish, but it does not make them the minority, right? The minority, that would presume again that these Afghan and Ukrainians that are allophones that come here are part of the majority in coalition with the others. It's absurd, but that's the argument you're going to hear pounded and pounded away to further justify reinforcing language legislation and attacking English language institutions. We need to think creatively and carefully about how we respond to some of that. And it's not going to be a simple task. It hasn't been a simple task. It's an ongoing one. And regrettably, tuning out like I tried to do isn't an option, right? If we're going to, try to have some meaningful impact on all this. So I'll stop there. And thank you very much. And Sylvia, no singing, but it's serious business today. So we'll continue along the more reasoned and thoughtful conversation with the forthcoming speakers.
So now I understand why you're not even answering my texts, but we should work on that next week. Thanks, Jack.
Okay, so thank you very much, Jack. And we can now move on to the next speaker, Emilie Nicolas, who is on the media, Radio-Canada, and etc. that we see. And Emilie, I wish you fun sharing with us some of your observations. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Richard. Thank you everyone for having me here. Jack ended his talk on we need to think carefully about how we're going to respond to this. And this is perfect. We didn't coordinate that, but this is exactly where I wanted to pick up from actually, and just share a few thoughts on how I think people should be responding to this. My only experience coming to, giving you the kind of roadmap that I'm about to perhaps give you in the next couple of minutes comes from more than a decade of trying to respond to those that kind of identity politics in Quebec. As was mentioned in my bio, I was part of the group that formed a kind of a weird, strange bedfellow coalitions back in 2013 when the Charter of Quebec Valley was proposed. We found a group that was comprised of people who had been involved historically with the Parti québécois, with Québec solidaire, with the Quebec Liberal Party, and who also, even the CAQ, actually, there was one or two people, and the people who were sovereignists, people who were federalists, people who were coming from the business sector, people who were coming from the left. And I mean, it was just 1 year after the student movement, obviously. So you had people who had been, shouting at each other in the street just a year before, who agreed to come together to combat this. And I think it made a huge difference in the end because of the kind of like public relation or public communication initiatives we're able to pilot on the down low, a lot of them not necessarily under the official label of Quebec Inclusive. For example, when the Jeannette were there putting out a manifest basically saying that feminism necessarily meant fighting the presence of hijabs in Quebec society, there was a group of us that were able to respond as well, and that created a lot of a mobilization and debate within the feminist movement. In 2016, I also started with a bunch of people, kind of reproducing that model, a campaign against systemic racism in Quebec. And once again, you had the goal of it was to get people to officially sign on this at the beginning of the launch, at the launch itself, people from all sorts of political stripes. We went to see, I think Alexandre Cloutier was an official signatory. We even got the approval of Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon, which obviously changed his mind on the existence of systemic racism afterwards. But obviously a lot of also, and that was the basis of it, right? Community organizations who had been, struggling with the issues, trying to bring the issue forward for a really long time. And so building a coalition between, as Jack was saying, right, everybody that's suffering from systemic racism is not a community, it's all sorts of communities. So trying to get early buy-on from Indigenous organizations, Black organizations, Muslim organizations, and trying to make everybody work together. And yes, there was a petition that every citizen could sign on the side of the National Assembly, but there was also a way for organizations to be able to join and add their names on this. And the spokespersons were doing a lot of meetings over more than 2 years, actually, with unions, with people behind the scenes, to trying to get people to buy onto this, or even just to have the conversation, so that even they were not ready to actually say, yes, systemic racism exists and it's a priority and we should tackle it. They were at least a little bit more informed on it. And I do believe that, part of that work and the many people who participated in that work did play a role in, when George Floyd died, or when Joyce Echaquan also died on camera, and then people were ready to acknowledge it a little bit more. Some of that behind the scene work actually played a big difference. And so I think, it's not the only way to look at this, but I think that kind of work is severely needed when it comes to also a bill like Bill 96. And I know that there are some courts challenges that are being planned. One of them with the English School Board of Montreal has been launched already. But the courts are a way for you to scrap maybe parts of the bill, but it's not a way to change public opinion. At the contrary, it might actually, make people even more pissed off that the courts tell them no, right? So there needs to be the two kind of strategies need to be used simultaneously. And the challenges are is that the bill has been, drafted many, many months ago. And for the longest time, I'm talking about Bill 96, right? For the longest time, it was mostly people in the English-speaking community in Quebec, people writing in the Gazette and such, who were being critical in the bill. And what I can see as a Francophone myself, and what I could hear, is that there's basically this thing where when it's coming from the Gazette or when it's coming from Anglophones, people are just not even listening to what people are saying. By people, I mean Francophone elites, because it's this thing where, they cried wolf before on Bill 101, therefore they're just being dramatic, they're just being historical. And so nothing, people weren't even taking the time to actually listen to the actual arguments that were made by Bill 96. And I haven't done an official recounting of all of this, but it feels to me that it was just like 10 days before the bill was about to be passed. Then you started to see Yves Boisvert, and then Emilie Nicolas, and then, practically everybody in la presse, and some people in other, Michel Séauger, like some people like that, who started to come wake up to, actually take the time to read the bill and see what's in it and be like, oh shit, sorry, I said it, but like, oh shit, like this is real, and there's some real human rights abuse in there. So I think there was a missed opportunity to mobilize, before, but there's still a lot that can be done about that. The other challenge as well that was faced is that, once again, there's just such a bad relationship with the CAQ and Indigenous peoples at this point, that also their point was just very, very hard to hear. They tried to get themselves heard through Québec Solidaire and the National Assembly, and Québec Solidaire did this thing where they're like, yeah, Indigenous people are important, but like not important enough for us to change our vote. So there as well, I don't think people have heard clearly and clearly understood what the argument is that people are doing in Kahnawake, or what the argument that Justin Picard is doing, or the argument that Cousette from the Native Center of Montreal is also saying in terms of people feeling empowered to not service properly people from Inuit community or from urban indigenous population. They were already treating them really more badly because of obviously systemic racism, but just Bill 96 can be used as a bad excuse to service those population even less when they don't speak French fluently. So I think there's obviously a lot of behind the scene talk that I'm assuming has been happening, but I haven't seen publicly people, Quebec Community Group Network and Indigenous people spokespersons and employees from the public sector who are worried about the application of the bill, and students' unions who are worried about their freedom of choice to be able to do whatever they want in CEGEP, and experts, just like we have on this panel, who are saying that, that's not how the situation of French language is. It's not in Quebec, is not being correctly described. I haven't seen all those people at the same time, at the same table, doing a joint, presser saying like, we're all standing together and agreeing on those, 5 points, and all of us represent all key, constituents, parts of Quebec society. It's not about the language that we speak. Obviously, there's a lot of people who are more progressive in the healthcare system or even in the education system as well, who are worried about how the bill is going to impact their ability to better service their students, the parents of their students who have just arrived in Canada, people who are working in francisation who are frustrated with the lack of resource in francisation. I've seen some articles, some things from all of those people individually, but I haven't seen all of those voices join together and taking the time to build an alternative to the mainstream narrative that we've been saying, that's been described by Jack and Richard in terms of what it is that the conservative nationalism of the CAQ is trying to accomplish in Quebec. And there's several different tools that could be used to do that. I've forgot to mention businesses as well, but yeah, there's a lot of like business association as well. Many of them run by francophones who are worried a bit as well about some of the applications of the bill as well. So definitely they could be reached as well in an attempt to do a kind of a joint statement. I think that what could be useful in terms of public relations is to not position ourselves as in everything's great, people are wrong to be worried, and this is why we should be nothing at all in terms of the French language. I think I agree with everyone that 94% of Quebecers speak French, and I very much push back against the narrative that everything is on the brink of collapsing. However, there's always more things that could be done, and I think if people are worried about trying to, because of the influence of global capitalism and globalization and whatnot, about the increasing power in English in economic life and in public life and whatnot, there are, I think, alternatives that we could propose that have nothing to do with actually stampeding on anyone's human rights. And I think I haven't seen also that. I haven't seen a lot of people saying, well, here's what I'd like to do to kind of promote French, given that I also understand that it's a minority language in North America and it's always going to be fragile. So here are the things that we could do that would not threaten anyone, and it would actually make Quebec a more inclusive place, such as really giving those resources to people doing the francisation work, the fact that there's so many people coming from out of province and there's going to be more of them given the housing prices, that Montreal is relatively cheaper compared to the rest of the country. A lot of them are not aware still that there's like free French classes that they can take if they move to Montreal. Those schedules, there's so many wait lines and there's so many ways. There's a labor shortage of the teachers. There's so many things that we could work on to actually try to propose something like make Quebec the world's, capital in terms of being able to learn French and have that additional language as part of something that's part of your personal heritage and your own abilities, and make that, something that we all want to push on as a society, just making French as accessible as possible as a projet de société. It's not something that is stampeding on anyone's human rights. At the contrary, and there's many more that the CAQ could do about that they're not doing. And I think calling them out on that would be something that would be well received in terms of public communication. The other thing as well is that building on the experience of English school boards actually in Montreal and other places that used to have lose a lot of students, right? And they still kind of do, but it's stabilized against, I guess, to the French system, because people in English Quebecers really want their kids to learn French, right? And so the way that we've stopped people from moving over to the French system, although they had the right to be in English system, is by pushing those French immersion programs. right? Because then it means that people are still being in school in an English environment, but they don't have to choose between being in an English environment and learning French. And I think there's an opportunity to build on that, to do the same for Francophone CEGEPs. I think a lot of people are worried that a lot of people, people who are in the French system coming out of high school want to be more bilingual. And the English level that is offered in Francophone CEGEP suck. It really, really sucks. And as a result of that, people are put between this choice. Either I, go to Dowson College and become bilingual, or I stay in the French system and I don't become bilingual. I remember myself in Quebec City, that's kind of the alternative that I had. I was like, I go to St. Lawrence CEGEP and become bilingual, or I stay in the French system and then risk not being able to push my English skills. And I was able to stay in the French system because I chose this program at Garneau, which is called the IB program, in which you have not 2, but 4 English classes, and those are English literature classes. They are bilingual, bilingual level classes. So I was able to push my English more within the French system. But the IB program is really not everywhere, and there's maybe 2 or 3 CEGEPs that offers it in a public CEGEP. Otherwise, in Montreal, it's very much a private school thing, which is expensive and really not accessible at all. So is there a way that we could actually push the offer for more optional, right? Optional English classes, higher level in the French system, so that if Francophones are tempted to go to the English system, they do it for all sorts of reasons that are not because they don't have the opportunity to also stay in the French system longer and push their English there. So basically, ideas like that we could name, we could list. There are so many things that we could do that would actually be, pushing for more diversity in arts and culture, because if people of all diverse background in Quebec cannot see themselves in the Francophone culture, arts and culture, they're going to tune out and go to see English speaking, cultural material, if that's where they can see people that looks like that. So there's so many things that we could do. And I think listing concrete alternatives to what promoting the French language could look like without stampeding human rights and abolishing or trying to divert from Charter of rights and freedom, I think would be very positive. And there could be way to list that, to list the actual grievances that people have with the actual bill and work together. It might not actually change the bill at this point because it's already passed, but it might change the implementation of it, which is not to come before an actual Ministry of the French language is actually set up. So there is still time for people to move the needle of public opinion, so that the actual directives that are going to be trickled down from government in terms of all the different agencies that need to be applying this bill could be modulated because of the fact that this public debate is being had in a way that's broader and coalition based. And I also think that there's more coming when it comes to immigration and whatnot, and having this stronger narrative that is non-partisan and not community specific of here is the alternative we want for building a more inclusive Quebec is really something that could be also used to move the needle on all sorts of things that the CAQ or Quebec nationalists are also about to do. So yeah, I think as Jacques was saying, the thing is that everybody's not impacted by that is not a group. It's just different segments of the population. And the thing is, and especially I think with the pandemic, the problem is that those different segments of the population have not been talking to each other as much as they could have otherwise. And I think if it wasn't for the pandemic, a lot of that would have happened even more to a higher degree as well. But it's not too late for us to make an impact and to actually, if some of that was to be done before the upcoming provincial election, it could also be used as a way to force a different opposition party to actually position themselves on some of the ideas that would be put forward by civil society. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emilie. Now we can move on to the judicial component of the issues, especially with, as we all know, the notwithstanding clause, the use of notwithstanding clauses. So Marion Sandilands is legal expert on quite a lot of judicial issues that are related to Bill 96 and other language laws. So thank you very much, Marion, to come with us today, and look forward to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. It's a real treat to appear today among these this fantastic panel. And I have to say, Emilie Nicolas, I was hanging on your every word. I think you had so many fantastic insights to offer and ideas. My talk today is going to be focused more on diagnosing the problem. So maybe you should have come after me, but it was so great to hear your thoughts. So we've heard from the panelists today about demographic, social, and political changes in Quebec, and today I will round off with a legal analysis. Note my disclaimer, although I serve as legal counsel to the QCGN, today I'm speaking on my own behalf in my capacity as a constitutional lawyer and concerned citizen. So today I will not be mincing words. I'm going to talk a lot about Bill 96, but I'm not going to talk much about language. When I started studying Bill 96 a year ago, the first thing I noticed was its level of sophistication. Years in the making. I saw in that bill a suite of changes, not only constitutional changes, but changes to the foundation of Quebec's public governance. I thought at the time I must be overstating things, seeing ghosts, but time has proved me right. I've stopped doubting. My presentation today is in 3 parts. First, I will describe how the notwithstanding clause is used in Bill 96 and put this moment into context. Second, I'll argue that Bill 21 and 96 are in fact a constitutional project. Third, I will discuss some other features of Bill 96 that require some very serious attention. And I'll wrap up with some closing thoughts on why this matters. First, the notwithstanding clause in Bill 96. Much talked about. Bill 96 ousts both the Quebec Charter and the Canadian Charter the same way as Bill 21, totally and preemptively to the full extent possible. Some argue that the use of the notwithstanding clauses in Bill 21 and 96 fits nicely into Quebec's tradition of using the clause. I have studied this literature very carefully. I've looked at every past use of the notwithstanding clause, and I've written a full paper about this. And I will spare you the painful details, but you can watch the video here on your spare time, where I take through the I'll take you through the details. I'm just gonna, oh, here we go. Little plug for me there. My conclusion of all of that analysis is this. That is a myth deliberately propagated by the authors and defenders of Bill 21 and 96. Bill 21 and 96, in fact, are a radical and complete break from any past practice. In the case of Bill 21, we have a clear finding from Justice Blanchard, the trial judge in the constitutional challenge. Do not be fooled. So beyond covering up charter violations, what else is happening with the notwithstanding clause in Bill 21 and 96? For example, for Bill 96, I'm often asked, okay, so which provisions really need the clause, in the sense that which provisions really violate charter rights and need the clause to be immune from challenges? Well, various charter rights are engaged in various places in Bill 96, but not every provision of Bill 96 obviously violates the charter. So that makes me think the total overrides we see are serving a different kind of purpose, and that purpose is a structural one. The use of the total preemptive overrides actually rearranges the hierarchy of laws in Quebec. Let's start with the Quebec Charter. Prior to Bill 21, the Quebec Charter was supreme in Quebec. It was at the top of the legal hierarchy of provincial laws. With its complete override, however, Bill 21 effectively demotes the Quebec Charter to second place and puts Bill 21 on top. And using the same mechanism, Bill 96 effectively places the Charter of the French language at the very top and demotes the Quebec Charter to third place. What about the Canadian Charter? Does the use of the clause in this way also rearrange the hierarchy of the Canadian Constitution? I would say that it does, or at least it tries to. In relation to these two laws, so Bill 21 and Charter of the French language, now Section 2 and 7 to 15 of the Canadian Charter are effectively no longer the supreme law in the province of Quebec. My second part, Bill 21 and 96, the constitutional project. Well, 2022 is the 40th anniversary of patriation and the Canadian Charter. The Canadian Charter had a political purpose. It was to be an instrument of Canadian unity. However, as we all know and are reminded of frequently, the charter was brought in without the consent of Quebec. The attempt to unite Canada backfired. The constitutional wounds from that moment have never healed. The failure of Meech and Charlottetown and the 1995 referendum did not heal the wounds. They left scars over scars. In 2009, Guy Laforêt wrote, quote, "On one day in the future, the question will resurface, and it will be part of the constitutional doctrine of a future government of Quebec," unquote. The way I see it, the question has now resurfaced. What is the constitutional doctrine of Bill 21 and Bill 96? Bill 21 and 96 share a number of common and novel features. First, both bills use the charter overrides in the same way. We've talked about that. Second, in both bills, we see a legal concept of the Quebec nation enshrined into provincial law. Third, we see express references to parliamentary sovereignty in both preambles. And from this, I see the drafters of both these bills knew what they were doing. I want to talk a moment about the Quebec nation. As a legal concept, this term is new in Quebec legislation. Aside from one water conservation statute from many years ago, the first appearance of this term in Quebec legislation was, in fact, Bill 21. With Bill 96, we see it again. The term Quebec nation is written into the Charter of the French language, the Quebec Charter, and the Constitution Act 1867. On my textual analysis, which I don't have time to take you through today, which I've done in other videos, the Quebec nation is not the same thing as the province of Quebec. The Quebec nation, as I understand the text, is a group of people whose membership is not defined anywhere. I would like to reflect for a moment on the pairing of the Quebec nation as a legal concept with the charter overrides that we see both in Bill 21 and 96. They appear, both of them appear. Does one have anything to do with the other? Constitutional scholar Sujit Chowdhury warns in places with competing national narratives, such as Canada, quote, "There is a danger that rather than transcending those national narratives, a Bill of Rights will be drawn back into it," unquote. And in that context, he was actually writing an article about the recognition of the Quebec nation in the 2006 House of Commons motion. Because patriation was done without Quebec's consent, for many in Quebec, the Canadian Charter is viewed as an externally imposed constraint on Quebec's ability to advance its own national interests. In Bill 21 and 96, we see the assertion of the Quebec nation coinciding with a rejection of the Canadian Charter. And what about the Quebec Charter in all of this? It has its own tradition in Quebec, a nationalist tradition, in fact. Jacques-Yvan Morin, a champion of the Quebec Charter and a minister under René Lévesque, he would have liked to see the Quebec Charter become more entrenched and harder to amend or override. But with the changes from Bill 21 and 96, the opposite has occurred. The Quebec Charter, in my reading, has been thrown out with the bathwater. With Bill 21 and 96, Quebec becomes, in fact, the only Canadian province where human rights charters are not the supreme law. In my reading, this is nothing short of a constitutional change and a change in confederation. I'll move on to my third point. Features of Bill 96 that require further attention. Beyond the use of the notwithstanding clause. A year ago, I listed some of these features that required attention, and in my view, they still require attention. Here's the list. 1, a unilateral constitutional amendment that recognizes a Quebec nation as distinct from the provincial entity of Quebec and whose membership is not defined. 2, the most sweeping use of human rights overrides in Quebec's history. 3, an increase in legislative power, the establishment of parliamentary sovereignty by ousting charter review by the courts. 4, a constellation of amendments to key provincial laws to establish the Quebec nation and the paramountcy of the Charter of the French language in Quebec's legal order. 5, an extension of Quebec's jurisdiction in applying the Charter of the French language to federally regulated businesses. 6, a decreased role, independence, and accessibility of the judiciary in Quebec. 7, new and expanded executive powers, including a new minister of the French language with wide-ranging powers, and expanded powers of the OQLF, which include search and confidential disclosure. Both the minister and the OQLF are given wide discretion and very little external oversight. 8, increased control and surveillance of language in the public and private sector. And 9, greatly enhanced penalties and sanctions. Together, in my view, this list reveals a new orientation for public governance in Quebec. For a year, I have refrained from giving this list a name. What I can say is that there is something hiding in plain sight. It needs to be called out with principle and credibility. Now, a conclusion. In case I haven't convinced you, why does this matter? I can think of at least 3 reasons. First, it affects the Canadian political community. If the charter is meant to be pan-Canadian, Canadians should have the same charter rights no matter where they are. This was a sticking point in the Meach negotiations. Now with Bill 21 and 96, we have the non-application of the charter, of the Canadian Charter in Quebec, over Quebec's 2 highest laws. In some sense, this is Meach on steroids, or asymmetrical charter federalism, or to be very provocative, 1 country, 2 systems. Second, this affects minorities. And the prior speakers have gone into great depth here. Bill 21 and 96 have clear detrimental impacts on minorities within Quebec. This affects social cohesion. And of course, I'm preaching to the choir, so I'll move on. Third, this affects the integrity of the Canadian Constitution. The Constitution is more than a text, it is practice and convention. In fact, and I say this as a lawyer, our Constitution is only as legitimate as we believe it to be. Strong constitutions protect against vagaries, populism, abuses of power. The charter overrides in Quebec, happening right now, set a precedent for future legislatures in Quebec and any province, or even federally, to override fundamental rights. But there's more. Bill 96, as I said, overrides human rights charters, illegitimately rewrites the Constitution, creates new and centralized executive power, and removes several checks on that power, all in service of the Quebec nation, whose membership is not defined. In so doing, it changes the orientation of government in Quebec. There is a constitutional project at work. These changes are major, they are in plain sight, and in 2022, we no longer have the luxury of closing our eyes to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marion. You put a lot on the plate. And I think that we should not be complacent about the points that you have made. And hopefully they will be discussed further, both in Quebec and Canada. So I think my role here is for various questions that maybe some of our enablers for the system, the video system, we can get some questions if there are any, if there's any time, because I haven't taken care of the timing features of this panel.
So
somebody could come in. Yes, Sylvia.
Your panelists and you, Richard, were terrific. And we are in a time crunch, but with permission, let's take a couple of questions because we're cutting into our bathroom break. And I've heard text from people that there is a need for a bathroom break. So let's take a couple of questions. I have colleagues in the office that are managing this as well, and they're probably at their wits' end because I'm taking up too much time here. So we have a couple of questions that we would want to pose in the question and answer chat.
Okay. Anybody? Oh.
No questions?
We're still stunned.
We're still stunned. Well, there was a lot of material there.
Yeah.
And it was very clear too.
Okay.
So, you know, there's always the possibility with us at the QCGN to write to me or to Eva, or like we are on, you have our emails. If there are questions.
There is a question now, Sylvia.
Oh, there is? Okay.
Yeah, go into the Q&A.
Q&A. How do we get the CAC to define Quebec nation? That's from Carol Mindell. Who's your question to, Carol? Well, how about if I just arbitrarily ask Marion to answer
Actually,
that question?
I would really like to hear from Emilie Nicolas on this question.
Okay. All right, go ahead, Emilie.
Hi, I don't know if people can see me or,
Yes.
yeah, okay. I think what we want is not get the CAC to define Quebec nation. I think we really don't want that. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, the whole point of what I was trying to accomplish in my own talk is to get them to not be able to do that. And that means that other people need to be using the trope or the idea or the notion of Quebec nation as a way to build an alternative narrative in terms of what it means. I do understand, what Marion was saying in terms of a legal perspective, and that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about it in terms of what people think of when they think of Quebec, and I do think that we need to have some sort of forum that's not going to be owned by any group. That's just going to be a meeting space where people can talk about that. They can talk about the impact of the bill, and just like everybody to start building those relationships. Especially my experience working with some Indigenous communities, you cannot just like start a space and then invite them in. That's not how it works. Like you really need to just have a neutral space, build on how we're good. Everybody needs to be owning this. And my own experience trying to build space like that there's always some sort of like corporate interests that are kind of like in there behind, where people are just trying to get credit for the work that's being done. And that's perhaps what kills those initiatives the most. I just build like a kind of a neutral space where everybody can come in and say their things. And that's like and have this vision for an alternative to what Quebec means. I'm seeing so many messages on social media and just people pouring their heart out in terms of how they're heartbroken.
Yes.
About how the CAC is trying to define what being a Quebecer stands for in a way that puts the vast majority, I think, of us in different ways in the role of the bad Quebecer or the anti-Quebec or the Quebec basher, like so many of us. And because they're getting their definition of Quebec more narrower by the minute, the people it excludes in terms of their vision of Quebec gets also bigger. And so there's an opportunity there. It sucks, but we can also see it as an opportunity. And I think getting that space set up and getting some sort of a text or something that people can sign on so that people can say, hey, I also disagree with this, and see the power in numbers. I think it'd be really, really great, because yeah, I think that's my nightmare. So getting the CAC to define what Quebec nation is.
I mean, if I just jump in quickly, but I know people.
Yes, go ahead. Yes, go ahead.
I think if you ask the CAC that, they're just going to say it's we're all part of the Quebec nation. Right, they'll give you some sort of simple answer that's going to suit them politically and that's going to look politically correct, even though that isn't what it means, depending on who you're speaking to, right? But that's what they'll say politically. So I don't know that there's significant value in getting to define it for us. I gather that's what Emilie's probably saying, that there's not significant value in getting to do that. But I think what we've been seeing in the past 20 odd years is a blurring of a lot of concepts, and a lot of this has to do with a lot of this comes from. I hate to say it, from people in the academy, without generalizing, because there's some fantastic people there, but they're blurring the notion of nation. Like we think of nation as equated with country, right? And so what's happened is you've seen this sort of compromise in the post Meech Lake or Meech Lake on steroids, where you get to blur the idea of country and state into nation. So there's nation as in a big group of people that live in a particular territory or that aren't defined territorially, and you've got country. So this is the way of blurring it, and you get all these intellectuals who blur the definition. Because in reality, the people who had wanted to put this vision out, the Alain Gagnons, for example, is a Quebec political scientist who is very invested in this vision, right? His idea was that there were three nations, right? There was the Quebec nation, the Nation Québécoise, the English Canadian nation, which of course isn't a nation, right? It's got no boundaries to it, right? Unless, depending on how you define nation. And you've got the Indigenous nation. Even though there isn't an Indigenous nation, there are many nations. But it didn't suit the purpose of Alain Gagnon to have 75 nations, right? Which is the Quebec nation, English Canadian nation, and the 70 plus Indigenous nations, because the reordering politically meant that you want to have un danse à trois, right? It's 3 units. So we go from being one of 10 provinces, which isn't acceptable, to one of 3, and sort of a reordering of our political weight, contributing to this blurring of the notion of nation, which involves a lot of intellectual sophistry. But we've become acclimatized to this. So if you say that there isn't really a Quebec nation, you're perceived as a redneck right now, at least in terms of the way Quebec structures its discourse and dialogue, right? So we have to be cautious about that. I was more blown away by some of this, Marion, thinking the way you were, and I still am sort of torn about it, but to some degree, this is a lot about, Quebec wanting to write anything it wants. It could write, we're the Blue Man Group in the charter. That's, we have to see actually, as you've said, what this means in terms of an actual reordering, because a lot of this is just discourse that's being translated, that's vaguely defined and still remains vaguely defined, right? Even though it's in the charter, we don't know who's part of that nation, right? So I'm sort of troubled by it, and yet I'm trying to understand what it means in practical terms on the ground for all of us. And let me say one quick thing also about many of the good points that Emilie made, right? In terms of, she's absolutely right, in terms of building that coalition across language boundaries and across other identity markers. But it's very challenging to do that. I get to engage a bit in the French media, and I know I'm a bit of a token, when I'm in the French media, I'm the sort of Anglo de service, and I think, Emilie, so are you a bit. I don't want to, we're all a bit tokenistic, in that media, but I look at my friend and colleague, for whom I have a great deal of respect for, Francine Pelletier. She had l'audace to take a very strong position against Bill 21. And we know what happened to her, right? We don't know explicitly, it's a number of other issues, but that is the sort of déclencheur. So it's a very complex thing, right? So, I mean, it's great what you do, Emilie. I think we need more Emilie Nicolas out there to say what you have to say, to be fair, but you're running that risk. If you cross a particular line, right, at a particular point, there's a risk, and there's something very unsavory about that. It's a very worrisome phenomenon right now in our society.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Jack.
Just quickly, I agree with that, and that's why if you don't put the power in an individual, but in a group, then the individual risk by everyone in this group is actually decreased. But like the single savior thing is actually a very dangerous model, and I don't think that's the model we want for organizing.
Emilie, may I add just something here?
Yeah.
I was involved with the QCGN right from the start when Marion first analyzed the Bill 96. And I must tell you that we tried very hard to build that coalition. Mm-hmm. And as Jack pointed out, there's this reticence of being labeled, even in the business. Quietly, people would agree with us, but nobody was willing to step up. We could not get across to the Francophone media. As it was only after the bill was passed, which is unfortunate, but there was a lot of time, and I agree with you, very important to get that coalition. We realized that right from the start, and we were not able to do it.
Yeah. That's why I hope I hadn't come across as like not seeing the
No,
that's
not
behind
the
the scene work that obviously been done. I do think that now that the bill is passed and that people are realizing there is perhaps more of an openness now, so maybe trying again. But I know it's really hard work, and it's tricky, and there's all sorts of pitfall, and but at the end of the day, that's, I think, work.
Eva knows full well from her experience, you've got to continue to roll your sleeves up. It's a new game.
That's right.
Bill 21, I hear a lot of people who are sort of very, very dejected about, Bill 21, and you just got to roll your sleeves up. But the problem is, it's like their sleeves are getting really short. That's
but I must also tell you that the narrative is, within a year we'll all forget about Bill 96, and that's the danger too. And I'm glad to see that we haven't forgotten about Bill 21.
So I have the ungrateful task to I want to thank all of you. I think I have the task also of noting the questions that we haven't been able to take the time to answer today. Somehow we'll get answers to you. We'll figure that out. And the other thing I would ask the panelists maybe we can have a debrief and see how we could continue together this conversation and faire du pouce sur ce qui a été dit ce matin avec vos perspectives. Et puis, je pense que ce serait une très bonne idée. Je vous remercie du fond du cœur.